came to the tree and began to learn from the fact of the tree, having started making sculpture with wood or mucking about with wood from when I was a kid. So I had already had a rapport with it. And art school using scrap wood, so that was all dry and already had some sort of history. And it was already been through a manufacture process, so there tended to be straight lines or boards. And then I began to, I couldn't afford to buy wood when I got to here. And then I used a fresh piece of wood for the first time. And then I've been told at art school, don't use fresh wood because it cracks and bends and warps when it dries, and then which is what it did do, and I loved it. So that's what drew me into fresh wood. So that's fresh off the tree. Because you're working with this substance, there's still a lot of moisture in it. It's got more, I had more direct feel into where it's come from, which is a tree. And then assuming then that the trees were made of wood, but then realizing that it's only wood when the tree's dead. While it's alive, and from science, recent science, we have to understand trees as sentient beings, like all plants. And there's a force, there's an energy, and it's going on all the time. So the whole thing is in flux, but it's been doing it for so long that it's in sync for those that are symbiotic and help each other, and those which are preying on others. There's all this working and interrelationships, and even trading. When I realized that the water content of the tree is drawn up through capillary reaction, hundreds of gallons a day, and it draws up water and minerals, but the tree cannot absorb these minerals without the interaction of fungi, which they can work the minerals into a substance which a tree can absorb, and that's what the tree absorbs and goes into photosynthesis, and in return the fungi get the excess sugars. So there's this trade, there's economy, that they all have this incredible life force. So I just learned more and more about our planet and the environment through trees. Because the great thing about trees is that they take just enough and they give back more, which is a mantra for what we should all be doing. There are other, I would call them forces behind the work. One has to admit that there's a certain, because I have staff, I have a payroll to fulfill every month, so there is an economic force to make the work, but that is not the primary force. It's there, but the most important aspect is that it stimulates ideas. And the great thing about when you find a piece of wood which is available, a branch or a whole tree, you've got this huge vein of possibilities, and which evolved into the wood quarries. But then wanting to have more volume, so that meant trunks of trees, and so happened that an oak tree in Mainturg, about 400 feet up on the foothills of the Molewins, an oak by a footpath had lost a very big limb and was unstable, and it was on rocky ground, and the park deemed it dangerous. It had to be cut down, and when I heard about it, I managed to actually get the job. I hadn't cut trees down before. I had to get someone to come and help me with that, and that started the first what became known as a wood quarry, because tree, a trunk with its branches and dividing forks and diameters of the branches getting smaller. It was like a vein of material, which is what, when you quarry stone, you are going for a particular vein of a particular rock. And I was quarrying it, and the first piece was a big, very rough ball. I'd made these smaller ash balls, which had cracked, which became the 9 crack balls, which was really the first piece that I'd made in the way that I now work, the first step on this long path which I've been treading. So I wanted to make a bigger one, so I with a saw, roughed out a rough ball, and the way to get it down to the road was either down a path, which was dangerous, some of it was very steep, or the stream, which was running by nearby, where I thought I could just lever it down there and the sides of the stream would contain it. So that became an adventure, which, the idea of rolling it down this waterfall into a pool with a splash, that was really what I wanted, was the splash. So I had somebody to take a photograph of the splash, and I rolled it down, but it didn't get into the pool, it just stuck. So that was the beginning of this piece of wood, rough ball of oak, not getting to the studio and staying outside, and eventually becoming a free-range sculpture, which was placing itself with the tides and rainfall. And the moon, a new moon, full moon, high tide, etc. The other work, in the meantime, can be very quick. As many of the pieces were made in one session. And that suited me, as I was really trying to avoid the anxiety of how should it be finished. So I decided on the process, and when I'd completed the process and there was an object, I wouldn't touch it again. So this oak tree, to explain the first piece, there were a succession of pieces made, and I realized that rather than trying to take bits of the tree down to my studio to work on, I needed to cut as much weight off as possible. So that just obviously meant making the piece is there. There was a whole tree, so I made the piece which went into the river, and then I made other pieces over about 18 months. I think I made 8 pieces from there. I wasn't going there every day, but I was still earning my living by lecturing around the country in various art schools. So then I was asked to be part of a group show in New York at the Guggenheim in 1980. When I got there, we opened up the crates, and here was the work. I've realized that there was a lot of expense had gone into making these crates and the transport. But the Americans I was meeting were the art handlers and the curators, which was very much in the art world. And I wasn't really meeting Americans. So adding these two aspects about the expense of all this, of transporting work across the Atlantic, and wanting to meet the culture more in a rural area rather than in the city, I had the idea that if any opportunity like this came up again to be in an exhibition overseas, that I would propose I went to the country and made the work there. And I had the example of the wood quarry in Turog. So this opportunity did come 2 years later in '82, and it was going to be in Japan, which was really the first overseas exhibition. And I made a whole group of work in 3 weeks, working right up in the mountains in winter, in snow, with Japanese woodmen. And they didn't speak English, I didn't speak Japanese, but we all spoke wood. So I only had to make a drawing of the next process, and they understood it straight away. It was great, and also it was the first time I'd worked with a team. I'd always been like Robinson Crusoe, doing it all on my own, and then I discovered the joys of interdependence. We'd look for wood, and the condition I made was it had to be naturally available by either it had blown over, it had died, or if there was some social need for it, like if a hospital was being built and there was a big lime tree, for example, which is something which did happen, that had to be taken down. So I would see that as fair game. A team would be assembled, a time would be chosen, the finance agreed, and so I'd just go in there, and usually just 3 weeks, I would make a museum show with the help of 5 or 6 others. All the tools would be provided. This went on for 15 years, so most of my work was made in this situation. You know, then I'd have these pieces of sculpture made, and this source of offcuts. Offcuts are fantastic. This is one of the things about a wood quarry, is that I usually start with making something I know I've made before, I know how to do it, and will use a lot of processes. So it introduces the people who are helping me to what we're making, and also I can see what their particular level of skills were. And it always happened about within 3 days, we would have a piece made and a lot of offcuts, and these offcuts are made unconsciously. They are, because I'm focusing on this object, so these offcuts come off, and they are just off, but they're in the periphery, and then I'll see one in my periphery, and it'll give me an idea. So there's a momentum, and there's a certain social dynamic with the people one is working with too, which I became to be something which I learnt how to nurture and really enjoy, and make it a joyous situation for everybody. My wife and I noticed I think it was an article in the Radio Times by Monty Don about cork trees. And there are photographed these cork trees when they're taken the bark off, they're harvested the bark, and they've gone red. The cambium, there's 2 cambium layers that I've learnt. There's an inner cambium layer, which grows the wood, and the inner bark, and then there's an outer bark, which is a fire-proofing device of the cork oak. That grows it like as if it was asbestos around the tree. Anyway, this outer cambium layer, when it's exposed to the light for 24 hours, it goes this wonderful bright orange, red colour. So I was very excited about the idea of drawing them. So we went to Portugal. We stayed on a cork farm, and there was a stack of 40 tons of cork bark, which was drying before the purchasers came to pick it up. And I learning about cork from the farmer, I was so excited about this great pile, this great stacks of it. I quite rashly said I'd want to buy 10 tons of it. And I wanted the inferior stuff. The best stuff goes to make corks for wine bottles. The rest is minced up and squashed to make cork blocks to be made into tiles, etc. So I worked out the volume, also I thought I had. So then when the harvest came and we went out and we just watched it being, the actual harvesting was so interesting. And the moment that it can be done, it's only like a 2-week moment of this particular, of this cork at this latitude and this altitude. It starts in the south of Portugal, and these same teams work their way up when the time is right to be able to take the cork off without damaging the cork tree. So that here in Blaenau, there's a Yonks, who does a lot of my transport. He went out with an Arctic truck to pick up the oak, and when he came back, he said, "I've only got half of it." So, also I had this huge volume of oak bark, and it so coincided with being asked by Kew Gardens to make an exhibition there. So they had, I visited, well, I can use the cork there. I can make a big dome of cork, and then later when the very first glass house became available, we were able to make inside there a 5-meter high cork spire. Yeah. So I started at Coed-Coexist. I had just realised the joys of unseasoned wood, and here was 4.5 acres, like a jumble of branches. So I volunteered to clear up and to replant. There was beech, and there was ash, and there was oak, rowan, willow. So over 2 years in my clearing up, I was just engaging with cutting trees, cutting branches down into smaller units, twigs, and putting a bundle of oak twigs in one hand and a bundle of birch twigs in another hand. They feel different. And that was what really excited me about the possibilities of being led by the material, which is, while I was working with the scrap wood, I was completely dominating the aesthetic. So it could only be as good as the aesthetic which was in me, which actually isn't that much compared to the aesthetic which is in the natural processes. So then all these branches, the thickest was about 30 centimeters, 12 inches diameter, and there was only a few of them, but the rest of it was a lot smaller. So I was making objects out of combining and bringing together and bundling and weaving and splitting and ramming the ends of split willow into each other to make structures. So I was trying to use the natural, what the wood would give me, which was like splitting was one thing, and then just splitting the ends and ramming them into each other. I could build a structure using that process. Working at Coed-Coexist, and it was just clearing up, finding ideas, and this is where I learnt the language. I learnt to speak wood at Coed-Coexist, and I learnt to speak the different dialects of wood, like oak. The language of oak is different to the language of beech and of birch. And reading, the wheelwright shot by James Sturt, written in the very early 20th century, about this wheelwright shot which made wagons, and about the different woods for different parts, like the hub and the spokes and the rim, and where to find the best trees, what particular, like elm was not always good, but you had to be able to recognize a good elm tree to be able to make your hubs. So I learned a lot, and woodland crafts too. I learned a lot about just in the history of the human being on Earth, how with ingenuity and imagination, the natural properties of these different woods was used. So so Coed-Coexist was a living laboratory for me, a research station, really. And then replanting, and that gave me the idea of actually growing a sculpture, because when you plant one tree, you plant a second tree, you're thinking about how far apart they should be, and then when you plant a third tree, and if you didn't want to plant them in lines, you were making it, you've got a triangle, so you've got your space. So one can imagine a space between them, and also this how static outdoor sculptures are. And most outdoor sculpture, public work, is made somewhere and transported in. So I just felt, you could feel that in a way it was alien. I mean, over time they become part of that environment. But also they need maintenance. And if they're not maintained, they look awful. So the idea of planting a group of trees to grow a space and a shape was fulfilling these questions which I had, how to have an outdoor sculpture which was spontaneous, and it would change through the year, and it would grow through seasons and years and decades. So I had this idea and a wish to grow a form. So what would the form be? There's a mountain here in Blaen, Manod Mawr, and as a lot of the mountains here, they're hollowed out with caverns by the quarrymen mining and extracting. And when I was very little, my grandfather had pointed up the valley to the Manod Mawr, which is like a dome, and he said, it's hollow. So I didn't imagine it hollow like a Swiss cheese as it was, but hollow as a vast chamber. So for several years, from the age of 7 to 10, I was looking at this mountain, imagining this black, dark dome inside it, and the Manod's a dome. So, and then I'm looking around, and from this spot where I was going to plant, it's the best place to plant a large work, I could see Manod Mawr, and then looking all around, the foothills are domed and the tops of trees are domed. So I chose a dome. And then which tree? Looking in farmers' hedges, I wanted obviously a local tree, an indigenous tree, which if they grew here, then they would grow naturally here, not to bring in something alien. And looking at studying the hazel, it didn't grow very big. Willow, I realized that's quite amenable, but very fractious. It can give up after a few 10, 12 years. A willow can just give up. And then looking at ash, and realizing the vigor of ash and the will forces of ash, and how adaptable they are to being interfered with, really, like bent over as the farmer does to make his hedge. And they seek light, so they will actually lean a long way from their roots. So this really was ideal properties, characteristics for what I was imagining, which is growing as dome. Then I'd imagined just bending them all inwards, and then I realized it would be like a ziggurat. So I realized I had to spiral them over the space. So I planted 22, regular intervals apart, about 30 feet, 10 meter diameter, which suited the size of this. It was the only flat area on this hillside, and was circular. Then waited. The first thing that happened was the sheep ate them. So that was the first lesson. So I fenced this area, started again. Rabbits were nibbling at the roots, put spirals up, plastic spirals, to stop the rabbits. So it's tough to be a tree. So I had to replace quite a few, but they continued to grow. And then it was when they were they've been in there 5-6 years. So this is 83. I started to bend them, and so I'd done a few tests on a small ash which were growing naturally at Coed, which was cutting a notch, bending them. The first ones, I only cut the notch halfway through. So when I bent, the fulcrum I was bending over was in the middle. So the bark on the other side ripped. So I realized I had to cut nearly all the way through, fold it, bend it over so the two sides of the cut met. And this would bring the cambium layer, which is just under the bark, in contact from the top side of the cut with the bottom side. And then we would bind that with a wet cloth and then with plastic to keep the moisture in and tie it onto the stake. And these bandages stayed on for 5 or 6 years as the tree grew. And from then it was pruning, really, because when you bend a tree over, a branch will take up the vertical growth, the lead growth. So it was, people say you've got a lot of patience to do that. Well, actually, I'm not a patient person, but I don't have to be there all the time, by any means. Because I was working there, I was regularly looking at these trees to see how they were doing, and then there were these interventions which I'd make at certain times. Pruning, a lot of pruning. And just making sure that the lead growth was going in the general direction I was going. So each tree began to take its own shape and own same characteristics. So they were like individuals, but they were generally doing the same dance, which is what I've always liked about it. And I also realized after about a decade that the trees obviously did not want to come in to each other because they were going to take each other's light. So I realized it would never actually meet in the middle. But if I got the ring and spiraling inwards, there would be enough gesture, like a drawing, to get the sense of a dome, of an inner space. And the point of the project was it was going to take a long time, because a lot of land art at the time was moments in just outside, not inside a building, but often in deserts or mountains. And there'd be a gesture made, it recorded, and then that would become like the document would be the surrogate artwork for the idea. But I wanted to advance that by making a piece which was of the energies of that particular place, but it would only happen if I stayed with it. So it was like a commitment. And I reckoned about 30 years. That took us into the 21st century, so that that's what I called it, a space for the 21st century. And then 2012, it was realized that ash dieback had come into the British Isles. It had been rumored, because it had been coming across from Eastern Europe, and it's come to be believed that it was an Asian fungi which in its environment was in balance. But when it got to Europe somehow, in a different environment. So I realized the ash dome was probably going to get it. But I then realized that, of course, if the idea, the concept is to grow a form out of the natural forces of that place, I'd have to accept the ash dieback as one of those forces. Because it starts at the top, the ends of the twigs start to die, so it's dying back. I've was thinking variously what to do with it. Do I try to find someone who would cast it into bronze? Do I cut them and preserve them and keep them and make a space to put it in? But they all seemed to be not in keeping with the original concept. But I felt with my work that these questions are something I'm not quite satisfied or I haven't resolved. They just live in me without me being that conscious about them, and then an idea, it'll just come through. So I thought, well, just start again with a different tree. And I had done experiments on some oaks which I'd bent over 20 years ago, and they had taken and had healed, and that cut had healed. So I hit on the idea of just, because I always felt the ash dome could have been a bit bigger, to actually plant a ring of oaks and bend it going the other way. So that's what we did, and that changed my whole feeling from this depression, because I felt I was engaging with an artwork which would outlive me, which I really liked, but then I realized it wasn't going to outlive me. So we've got the oaks, planted them. My younger son and my main man, Sam, assistant, were actually born on the same day in the same year. And they both got 2 children, a boy and a girl. So I thought, well, and Sam is very keen on the ash dome. Jack is involved. So as 3 generations, we were there planting it, hoping that these generations would continue growing and nurturing the oak dome after I've gone. But as they're all flourishing now, the actual ash dome falling down, which it has started to do, has actually become quite exciting to be in on this end game of it. And also I found that if I put an end date on the ash dome, because I've always when I've made a drawing of it, or a documentary drawing about it, explaining the process, I've said ash dome, February 1977, with an arrow onwards. But now it's ash dome 1977 to 2019, which is when we planted the oaks. And in the film you can see over time how the quality of the camera has improved. And also with the ash dome, you see me at the beginning as a vigorous young man, and then over time I get older and older and older, very like the ash dome itself, where I'm creaking in the same way as the ash dome is.